First of all, if you want to solve the housing crisis, you don't do as both Fianna Fáil and the Greens and then Fine Gael Labour did under NAMA, is sell off 40 billion or more worth of land and property assets to property speculators and vulture funds. Okay, that's the first thing you don't do.
Yeah, but hang on a second.
Instead,
hang on a second. Just your manifesto says that council houses, everybody should be entitled to them.
yeah,
should we know it?
Absolutely. All across Europe, and Austria was mentioned, all across Europe, the state builds public housing, and whether you're a doctor or a professor, or whether you're somebody on very low income, you can apply for social housing, and your rent will be set according to your ability to pay. And that removes the stigma around social housing, which doesn't exist in the rest of Europe. We have created a stigma around social housing because you have to be under what is now a very low income threshold in order to be eligible for it. Another thing you could do is have the publicly owned banks not charging double the interest rates for people who want to buy their own home and take out a mortgage, which is what's happening in this country at the moment. Somebody who takes out a mortgage from banks that are owned by the state and were bailed out by the state are paying over the course of a 30-year mortgage about €56,000 more than they would by their European counterparts, because basically the publicly owned banks are racketeering on the back of people who are trying to buy homes. You would also you would also control rents. Across the rest of Europe, Claire, across the rest of Europe, even in the United States, in the heartland of capitalism, the state or local authorities set rents. They do not allow racketeering around rent.
Okay, so the last point is the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council criticised this government for spending just over $3 billion. You propose spending $8 billion.
Yeah, and that would bring us to the average levels of public spending in Europe.
Where does that come from, though?
The
Irish Fiscal Advisory Council says 3 was a bad idea.
In exactly the same way as they do it in Europe. We spend 28% of GDP on public spending. The average in Europe is 41%. And that's why we've got a housing crisis, our health services in bits, we have the most overcrowded classrooms, and we have a massive infrastructural crisis. And we have childcare that is completely unaffordable.
So where do you get the money?
So we do it exactly how they do it in Europe, okay, where they tax profits at a higher rate than we do, where in this country, for example, 2 years ago, Starbucks, who made €1 billion in pre-tax profits, paid zero tax. Zero. Kennedy Wilson, one of the property speculators, Cerebus, Iris Reid, all these people are paying 1 or less than 1% tax on massive profits that they are making, right? And this is the hidden secret of the Irish economy. Profits in this country have gone up over the last 10 years by 120%, from 70 billion to 170 billion, but they are paying about 4% tax. They should pay their fair share.
Okay, I'm going to come to you on this.
One last point.
I know, come on.
Just in direct answer to the question.
Yeah.
Okay, we believe the USG should be cut for anybody earning less than 90,000, which would cost 3 points.
Generous.
Absolutely, because workers have gone from paying 21% of tax that is taxed in this country to 32% in the last 10 years. In other words, if workers out there are feeling screwed by unfair taxation, it's because that's what's happened over the last...
Martin, on with...
I just want to challenge the idea that pensioners getting restoration of the pension age to 65 is somehow leeching off other workers. Pensioners pay for their pensions through their PRSI contributions. The people who really robbed the pensioners were the people who took 17 billion out of the National Pension Reserve Fund to bail out the banks.
Okay.
That was the robbery of the...
All right. Roisin Shortall, Richard Boyd Barrett.
Claire, first of all,
really quickly now.
First of all, Fianna Fáil propped Fine Gael up for the last 4 years and allowed the situation to develop.
All right, we've had that point. Yeah, we've had that.
Yeah, I'd like to make another point as well, Claire, which is when I brought a bill into the Dáil in 2017 to introduce an amendment to the Constitution to give a secure, affordable right to housing in the Constitution, both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael voted against it. When I brought a motion into the Dáil to try and take robust measures to deal with property speculation and land hoarding, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil voted against it, because time and time again, as they did before the crash in 2008, after the crash, they protect the interests of people who are controlling the property market.
All right,
I'd like to see a left government, but to be honest, I think there's a very, very bitter taste in people's mouths over the last time that the Labour Party were in government, because people voted for them in huge numbers.
But who passes your purity test then?
Expecting change, and many of the promises they made, they turned on, and they imposed absolutely crippling austerity.
It's absolutely untrue.
Well, listen, we'll agree to disagree, Brendan, but people will judge for themselves, and it was a disaster for the Labour Party.
So who is left enough for you then?
Well, I think people have to prove that they are genuinely committed to left-wing principles, and indeed the promises that they make before an election. And my appeal would be to people who would see themselves on the left is not to use the votes that they get in this election, where for the first time in the history of the state, more than 50% of people are expressing a desire for a government without Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, not to take that vote to prop up one or other of those two parties who've dominated this state for its entire history, a two-party state for its entire history. I believe there's an appetite for change, not least because those two parties in recent years have left us with a bitter legacy of the worst ever housing crisis in the history of the state, a disastrous state in our health service, crucifying cost of living for huge numbers of people. I don't agree. I genuinely believe we could have a left government, and I actually think there is a growing an unprecedented appetite for a left government, but I think you would throw away that opportunity, as was done by the Labour Party the last time, which was a disaster for them electorally, apart from anything else. And indeed, the Greens before them almost destroyed themselves by going into coalition with Fianna Fáil.
I want to come to Eamon Ryan now.
Are you going to reverse the decision to close rural Garda stations?
I fully understand why rural Ireland, which has been run down and has seen post offices taken off it, bus services taken off it, is suffering from depopulation and big and growing regional imbalances, would want to hang on to their Garda stations. I personally do not believe that we can police our way out of the rising level of crime, violence, organised crime and so on. I think if we could, the United States would have done it, which is one of the most policed societies in the world, where we actually have more people in prison, we have more organised crime, we have a bigger drug problem, so I don't think that's the answer. What I do...
Your colleague Ruth Coppinger said it's ridiculous to blame people who take cocaine at the weekends for fueling gangland violence.
I don't think it's about what individuals consume any more than whether anybody got drunk once or took antidepressants explains the problems that can develop. But if
there's no market, there's no gangland, surely.
No, the problem is there is a demand. It's a reality in our society, but we have driven it into the criminal underworld, and we're criminalising a lot of our youth. And making the situation even worse. I think that's counterproductive. I do think we need to look at models like the Portuguese model, where decriminalisation has led to less drug-related deaths.
But more Gardaí is not for you. That's
no, but sorry, and one other point, Claire, that's terribly important, and it was a big point emphasised I saw in Drogheda, and it's certainly the case in many parts of Dublin where these are real problems, is that the cuts to drugs task force, the cuts to community development projects, to community and youth outreach workers have been a disaster in terms of failing
I'm going to come to you in a second.
Alternatives to young people.
All right.
I'd like to ask the panel what's their plan of action as regards the reduction, the proposed reduction in the national suckler herd, and at the same time meeting their commitments as regards climate change activation.
Okay, we think ever expanding the herd is actually reducing prices and hurting farmers, and of course gets even worse then when you have the Mercosur deal importing beef from halfway across the world into the European market, further driving down prices and putting farmers under pressure.
So how do you propose you replace those farmers that have to reduce their herd by half?
First of all, you've got to guarantee them decent prices for their beef. secondly, we've got to reorientate the supports for the small farmer, for the family farmer, and have that paid for. Essentially by making the big beef barons and dairy barons who are really making the profits actually pay some tax and are gaining most of the benefits from the cap payments actually redirected towards the small farmer. And in particular, we need to have much better subsidies and supports for farmers making the transition to things like forestry, wilding, biodiversity measures, where they will actually be paid rather than punished for moving towards a carbon neutral economy and agriculture.
Where do you stand on this? Because we see that we have struck